Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast, From the Vault. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. We are diving back into South Carolina's Fourth Regiment Order Book for today's episode. It's August of 1776, and the people of South Carolina have just heard the Declaration of Independence read aloud for the first time. They fought and won a battle back in June earlier that year, and they're still standing their guard. Some soldiers with better behavior than others, while the American Revolution continues. But before we get too far into the order book, let's hear some announcements. May is Preservation Month, which makes it a great time to take an architectural tour of our headquarters, the historic fireproof building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston. Our education coordinator, Melina Teston, offers the 45-minute guided tours every Friday at 2 p.m., and the cost is $5. Our COO and senior archivist are heading out for their talks on how to start organizing and preserving records, whether they're family, organization, or church records. They'll hold their first event in June on Sunday, June 1st at 3 p.m. at the Orangeburg County Historical Society on Middleton Street there, and another on Thursday, June 5th at 6 p.m. at the Calhoun County Museum and Cultural Center in St. Matthews. For more information on all of these events and more, check out the Program and Events page at our website, schistory.org. All right, so it's time for sources. Now, in addition to Captain Barnard Elliott's order book of the 4th Regiment housed in our archives, the other sources we used for today's episode are The Papers of Henry Laurens, Volume 11, edited by Philip M. Hamer et al., South Carolina Upcountry, 1540 to 1980, Volume 1, by E. Don Hurd, Jr., an online article titled Captain John Detreville, Continental Officer and British Spy, by Douglas R. Dorney, Jr., accessed through the Journal of the American Revolution, South Carolina Patriots in the American Revolution by Bobby Gilmer Moss, Historical Register of Officers of the Continental Army during the War of the Revolution by Francis B. Heitman, and Speech of His Excellency John Rutledge, Esquire, accessed through the Northern Illinois University Digital Library. All right, so again, it's August 1776. We talked last order book episode about how there were many instances of soldiers being punished for bad behavior, like desertion, gambling, and ungentlemanly and scandalous conduct. But at the beginning of this month, the South Carolina American and General Gazette presents the first published account of the Battle of Sullivan's Island to the public. And with the public getting to read the details of their victory, will we find they behave a little better now that they've got some clout? Let's find out. Regimental Orders, 5 August. Officer of the Day tomorrow, Lieutenant Detreville. Officer of the Day for the Magazine Guard, Lieutenant William Mitchell. Quartermaster Ogier is to receive 50 stand of arms today from Mr. Calvert, which he will put into the regimental store at barracks. The commanding officers of companies are to make a return immediately of the number of arms wanting in their respective companies to complete. 6 August, parole Sparta, countersign Rome. Regimental orders. Major Elliott with the detachment already ordered for Fort Johnson are to embark for that post on Thursday morning, 5 o'clock. A schooner will be ready at Gadsden's Wharf to receive the troops. So now our guys are going back across the harbor from the Charleston Peninsula to Fort Johnson, which is on James Island. Now, if you remember, this is where they were when the order book began. The soldiers were taking this fort, Fort Johnson, from the British, though the British had kindly left it unoccupied for them, so it wasn't too difficult of a task. But now they're back there almost a year later. Orders by Major Elliott at Fort Johnson, 9th August, 1776. That 1 sergeant, 1 corporal, and 15 privates do mount a guard for this fort and relieve the guard of the 1st Regiment immediately, and that sentinels be placed on the ramparts, at the magazine, and at the gates of the fort. Also, that 1 corporal and 9 privates do mount a guard at the Western Battery and relieve the corporal's guard there belonging to Colonel Gadsden's regiment, and that sentries be placed there as usual. These guards to be regularly relieved every 24 hours. Captain White is appointed officer of the day. He will visit the guards frequently through the day and often at night, not less than 5 times within the 24 hours. The reveille will beat at the dawn of the morn, the troop at 7 o'clock when the roll is to be called and the guards relieved. The retreat will beat at sunset and roll again called, and the tap to will beat at 9 o'clock at night when all fires in the garrison must be extinguished and the gates of the fort drawn up, which must not be let down till the reveille beats. No person to be suffered to enter the gates of the fort after dark without giving the countersign, and no bodies of men together without first acquainting the commanding officer and having his permission for admitting them. 10th August. Countersign, Roberts. Ordered that Lieutenant Davis, with a fatigue party of 8 men, do clean out the fort and have the platform swept, the sponge staffs, ladles, worms, handspikes, and wads boxed on the rampart of the upper works, and that the spears be brightened and cased. It is earnestly recommended to the officers that they use their utmost endeavors to keep their men clean and decently dressed, and that they never give them leave to walk out of camp or garrison without first knowing whether their arms are bright and in readiness for action. 12 August. Orders by Colonel Roberts. A court-martial to sit tomorrow morning for the trial of Delaney, Wood, and Andrews, all of Captain Drayton's company. Adjutant Nixon and Joshua Garrard of Captain Beckman's company will attend as evidences. Captain Beckman, President, Lieutenants Grimke, Beckman, and James Mitchell, members. Parole, Georgia, countersign 1. So the court-martials do continue, and though this entry doesn't spell out what the 3 men there that are sitting for that court-martial are being charged with, this won't be the last time in this episode that we'll hear about them. So, more coming soon. 12th August, Parole, Florida. Officers are to take particular care that none of their men sleep out of camp. No huts will be suffered to be built without the line of encampment. The court-martial for the trial of Delaney and others will sit at the President's house at 10 o'clock this forenoon. Sergeant Cameron to be added to the number of evidences against the prisoners. So we're going to talk more about the huts that were mentioned in this entry a little bit later and how the soldiers actually built them for themselves. But first, let's talk about the President's house, where the court-martial that's mentioned in this entry is to be held. It's still standing today on Broad Street in downtown Charleston. The president of South Carolina, as he was called at the time, was John Rutledge, and he was serving in a role that today we would call the governor. But his home on Broad Street, like I said, is still standing and has been turned into the John Rutledge House Inn. So if you're in Charleston, you can walk along the street there and imagine what it would be like if you were fighting in the American Revolution and got called up to the president's house for a wrongdoing that you were charged with. 13 August, Parole, New York, countersign 2. Sharp of Captain Beckman's company and Shepard of Captain White's are appointed to fish and take care of the colonel's boat, on which account they are to be excused guard duty. 14 August, Parole, Jersey. All guards to turn out with rested arms to the field officers once a day. All sentinels to stand well-shouldered when an officer passes them. The commanding officers of companies are not to suffer more than 3 men to be absent with leave at once from their respective companies, and those the furthest from duty. The men of the different companies who have not received clothing, arms, or accoutrement must attend the quartermaster at 12 o'clock this day for the receipt of them. A court of inquiry to sit this afternoon to inquire into and report of the reasons of Hugh Lowry of Captain White's company appearing without regimentals, and, if lost, who, in their opinion, should make good the damage. Francis Reagan and others may be examined on the subject. Major Elliott, President. 16th August, parole, Cherokee. The regiment to be under arms immediately to attend a punishment at which the doctor is to be present. There is nothing else that I can find about this. It seems like they might be referring to putting someone to death since everyone is required to be present and the doctor is needed to be there. It's really frustrating to me that we don't know who is being punished and why, but it's just not something that I was able to find out. But then, after that pretty somber note, the order book changes tone. The colonel is rendered very happy by the regiments affording him an occasion of returning them his sincere thanks for their very quiet and soldier-like behavior since their arrival on this island. 'Tis with the greatest pleasure he views this laudable alteration of conduct in men, entreats they will not grow weary in well-doing, but pursue the path they now are in, by which they will not only merit and meet with his portion of praise, but that of the whole colony, joined to the approbation of mankind and their Maker. Owen Roberts is the colonel that this entry refers to, and we've talked a little bit about him before. In 1779, so just a few years after what's happening right now, he will be killed in the Battle of Stono Ferry here in South Carolina. And there's actually a painting by Henry Bainbridge that depicts his dying while handing his sword to his son, who was also fighting in battle, to continue the fight. And the island that they referred to there in his praise of the soldiers' conduct must be James Island, since they're stationed at Fort Johnson at this point, which is on the coast of James Island. So it sounds like, maybe getting them out of the city limits has done wonders for their behavior, if Colonel Roberts is taking the time to congratulate them on it since arriving there on the island. 17 August, 1776, parole Gadsden, countersign 4. The signal for the colony pilot boat is lowering her pendant half-mast for passing Fort Johnson. The adjutant must wait on the colonel in garrison every morning at guard mounting, and it's expected all morning orders will be issued by 9 o'clock a.m. 18th August, orders in camp by Major Elliott. As nothing contributes more to the health and credit of a regiment than that of cleanliness, it is earnestly requested that the officers pay the utmost attention to the dress of the men of their respective companies, and that they see that non-commissioned officers are not negligent in their duty respective of this order. A regiment can never arrive to any degree of credit but by the care and attention of its officers. Where that is wanted, the men fall into a slothful negligence of their dress and arms, and as the inferior generally looks for example from the superior, it is not doubted but the commanding officers of companies will show an example proper to be followed by their inferiors. The non-commissioned may then be taught that it is their duty not only to drill men, relieve guards and sentries, but to see their soldiers brought clean upon the parade, with their arms bright and in good order, their clothes well put on, their hair combed, their shoes brushed and buckled, and their stockings or leggings well tied up. The regiment being now at an outpost where an enemy may constantly be expected, the greatest care ought to be taken of the accoutrements and arms, and at the beat of drum every man in camp should be in an instant ready for action and upon the parade. They should not either stay till the drum ceased or be looking to see who would be the last, but on the contrary, vie with each other in being the first to obey the call. The sick should be carefully attended to, but those that are discovered to feign sickness in order to escape duty will be physicked as they deserve. The sore-legged are advised to walk as little as possible and to observe the doctor's particular directions, lest their long disservice to the public may rank them among the drones of the world. In order to bring this regiment to that adroitness at arms which is requisite, the officers are desired to have their men properly paraded at 5 o'clock every afternoon, beginning tomorrow, when they will be exercised in battalion. These orders, as well as all others, are to be read by an officer to each company at retreat beating when the roll is called. The articles against mutiny and desertion are to be read regularly on Mondays, as heretofore by the adjutant, and on Thursdays by an officer to each company. As the growing trees within the line of the encampment afford a refreshing shade in the sultry heat of the day, it is ordered that, for the future, none be cut down or otherwise destroyed. Orders by Colonel Roberts, Parole Union, countersign Courage. The further punishment of Delaney and Wood is respited until Monday. A lot going on in that entry there. Obviously, some orders to the men about their cleanliness and their appearance and their readiness for battle, because as they mentioned, they are at an outpost now. So they're on Fort Johnson, which is one of the first islands that a ship coming to the harbor would come across. And so they have to be ready at all times. And then I love that, just like us nowadays, they're looking for some shade out there. I mean, especially back then, because there was obviously no air conditioning or buildings or fans even. So they decided to keep the trees up, and they're not going to cut those down, which probably would have been done for visibility's sake, but they need that shade because it is August in South Carolina. And you may remember that the men mentioned at the very end there, Delaney and Wood, were mentioned at the beginning of this episode, and their court-martial was being called for. So it sounds like, even though we didn't get the details in the order book, that they were found guilty, since it's mentioning their punishment, and maybe already had received some of that punishment. But the next entry tells us a little more about the idea of discipline under Colonel Owen Roberts. Orders by Colonel Roberts in garrison, 19th August, parole freedom, countersign 5. The regiment to be under arms immediately to attend to punishment. The colonel, being always more inclined to correct than to punish, thinks proper to remit 200 lashes of Delaney's sentence and 350 of Woods's, in full hopes of their becoming in future reformed men and more dutiful soldiers, which, should they prove, they may yet show themselves worthy assertors of that glorious cause which they have most solemnly engaged with their lives to defend. The colonel expects such men will very seldom be indulged with leave of absence to town who do not return at the limited time, nor must any men be suffered to go to town dressed in any other clothes than the uniform of the regiment. That's a hint there about what Delaney and Wood might have been charged with, talking about going to leave into town and not returning back when they were supposed to, or maybe going in their personal clothes and not the uniform, which they're supposed to be wearing at all times now because they are representing those fighting for independence. Orders by Major Elliott in camp. As the drummers are incapable of beating the reveille, the French horns will play at the dawn of the morn, when it is expected every soldier in camp will rise and comb his hair and clean his hands and face and be ready for the duties of the day. Colonel Roberts' orders, parole Lee, countersign ugly, 20 August. In order to preserve that peace, harmony, and due subordination observable amongst the soldiers since their arrival at this post, 'tis expected every officer will use his best endeavors to prevent clandestine rum sutlering, either by soldiers, their wives, or strangers. Should any such be found at any time, they will not only forfeit their liquor, but subject themselves to severe corporal punishment. When any officer wants to be absent from the regiment, he must inform the major, as well as the commanding officer thereof, together with the officer's name, who will do duty for him during such absence. A sutler was a civilian who sold items to soldiers when the soldiers were traveling or in camp, and they often followed groups of soldiers around. So Colonel Roberts is warning the men that while they've been doing a great job lately, they need to keep working at it. And by prohibiting rum to be sold to soldiers, or by the soldiers, he's hoping to keep that going. And that punishment sounds pretty harsh. I mean, we heard a portion of Delaney and Woods' punishment in the last entry, several hundred lashes. So I would imagine that the corporal punishments that they refer to in this entry would be much of the same. 30th August, parole Gadsden. The sick to be removed from the old to the new hospital as soon as possible. Orders by Colonel Roberts, 31st August, parole Pinckney. Finding by the morning report the sick to be double of those so reported by the doctor, the commanding officer desires the sick and sore-legged may all be sent to the hospital from their respective companies. To prevent neglect and that malingerers may be punished, the doctors will attend the hospital every morning by 7 o'clock and at 5 in the evening. 2 September, parole Boston. Orders by Captain Beckman. 3 men for fatigue, 1 of each company, to attend this morning with axes and etc., to cut and shear away the underwood and brush between the camp and the works. Orders by Colonel Roberts, 4th September, 1776. Parole Jerseys, countersign Victory. Sergeant Thompson and 2 privates to attend Lieutenant Ephraim Mitchell in making a survey of the island. I mean, side note, how amazing would it be to find the survey and be able to look at what they were looking at when they were there on the island? 8 September, parole Elliott, countersign 45. General orders by General Lee. as it is of the utmost importance to the common interests of America that the South Carolina and Georgia battalions should be completed as soon as possible, General Lee, in capacity of Continental Commander of the Southern District, gives full authority to the officers of said South Carolina and Georgia battalions to engage into the service of their respective regiments any soldiers or non-commissioned officers of the regiments of Virginia and North Carolina, on condition they pay into the hands of the colonels or commanding officers of the regiment, which the soldiers or non-commissioned officers quit, the bounty money which is now allowed to recruits, and settle the accounts which exist betwixt such soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and their captains. Drummers and fifers are not allowed to be engaged. Signed, Charles Lee, Major General and Commander of the Southern District. Regimental orders. The regiment to turn out with arms to attend Bailey's funeral this evening at 5 o'clock. So this is another one. I tried my hardest to find out who Bailey was, but to no avail. They must have been fairly important if the regiment was required to participate. I checked several books, including The Roster of South Carolina Patriots in the American Revolution by Bobby Gilmer Moss and Historical Register of Officers of the Continental Army during the War of the Revolution by Francis B. Heitman, but neither had a person named Bailey listed who died during this time period. So it's possible I'm reading the name incorrectly, or that it was someone who had no affiliation with the military, someone who was involved with the city maybe, but at this point, I'm unsure. And the part about soldiers coming from other states refers to the practice of soldiers joining a regiment in one state or area and getting a bonus, and then deserting to join another and collect the bonus there too. This was really hurting numbers for the Continental Army, and they were trying to put a stop to it with rules like this, where a bonus had to be paid back to the original regiment if a soldier joined another. 9th September, parole freeman, countersign 15. Men not contented with the indulgence granted them by good officers, having taken liberties directly contrary to orders and the good of the service, renders it necessary for the commanding officer to inform the regiment that no leave of absence will be granted any person until further orders. It sounds like the good behavior streak has ended, but their general, Charles Lee, is about to head north and leave the Southern District, and he at least leaves good words for the officers in this next entry. General Orders by General Lee, Charlestown, 9th September, 1776. General Lee thinks it his duty before his departure to express the high sense he entertains of the conduct and behavior of the colonels and officers of the battalions of South Carolina, both as gentlemen and soldiers, and begs leave to assure them that he thinks himself obliged to report their merits to the Continental Congress. September 13, orders by Colonel Roberts, parole St. George, countersign Victory. A court of inquiry to sit tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at the President's house. Major Elliott, President. Captains Beckman and Drayton with Lieutenants Filipponto and Ephraim Mitchell, members. They are to inquire into and report the conduct of Lieutenants Detreville and Gilbank relative to their behavior as gentlemen and officers in a late dispute of theirs. Lieutenant Grimke, Major Elliott, and such other gentlemen as the court may think proper to order the attendance of, are to appear and give evidence of, though not upon oath yet on their honor, without the least partiality, favor, or affection. The evidence of any of the members composing the court may also be taken. 14th September, parole Alfred, countersign 92. The Court of Inquiry on the conduct of Lieutenants Detreville and Gilbank is dissolved, being of the opinion the gentleman's behavior was consistent with propriety. Commanding officers of companies may tomorrow give leave of absence to their men, agreeable to an order of the 14th August, strictly attending the letter of the same. After orders, Lieutenant Ephraim Mitchell and Detreville and William Mitchell are to hold themselves in readiness to go recruiting forthwith. 26 September, parole Sweden, countersign enslaved. Officers commanding companies are to see their men moss and clay their huts as expeditiously as possible. Not a man of any company must be permitted to go to town until every one of those returned, save deserters whose limited leave of absence may be thought expired. So they've got their leave back, at least in some cases. But I was a little surprised by this entry, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast because they do refer to huts at the beginning in one of the entries, but this sort of brought it home for me when they were talking about the soldiers having to moss and clay their huts. thought this whole time that the soldiers stationed at Fort Johnson were sleeping in tents, but it sounds like some of them, at least, are in huts that they had to work on, construct themselves, and repair when necessary. In a previous episode, there was an entry dedicated to who was to receive a tent, and that was the first time that this regiment were stationed on James Island at Fort Johnson, and it listed out if they didn't have one of their own, each captain was to receive a tent, or subalterns, which was an officer that was just under captain, were to receive one tent per two of them, and then one tent per company for sergeants. So perhaps the huts were for men lower than these officers listed out that had the tents, and then they had to build them themselves and work on them and repair them to make sure that they were in good working order. Orders by Major Elliott in camp. 27th September, parole heaven. Ordered that on Tuesdays and Fridays of every week, the battalion is to take the field and there be exercised by the commanding officer present, and that on those days the officers shall turn out with their respective companies and battalion, properly dressed, carrying their fusées and wearing their cords, gorgets, or sashes. The non-commissioned officers and private men must be clean dressed, their hair combed and tied up in a club, be fully accoutered, put on their gaiters and uniform clothing. On those field days, no man belonging to the regiment, except such as are on guard or sick in hospital, shall be excused turning out. Orders by Colonel Roberts, 28th September, parole, Denmark. An officer of each company must every morning visit the hospital at the time the doctor attends to receive the convalescents and discharged men. The officer of the day must visit the hospital once every day and see it is kept clean and in proper order and report its state to the commanding officer, lest the sick be neglected. The regiment to be under arms at 5 o'clock this afternoon, and as much of His Excellency's speech concerns behavior of the troops on the 28th June, together with the answers of the two houses to be read to them. This speech was given by John Rutledge, who was president of South Carolina at the time, to the General Assembly just a few days before, on September 19th, 1776. And he began the speech, just as the entry there mentioned, by talking about the Battle of Sullivan's Island, congratulating the soldiers and saying that it demonstrated their dedication to the cause of liberty and their capability of achieving victory. He also says that the soldiers recently defeated the members of the Cherokee in the back country of the state. And in his conclusion, he asks the General Assembly to take this time to make a law to improve the militia so that they're better able to fight in the future, because more fighting is likely coming, according to Rutledge. Now, the conflict that he mentions in his speech with the Native Americans in the backcountry was not a small one, and it accounts for the first death of a Jewish person in the American Revolution. Francis Salvador had just recently emigrated to what were then the American colonies in 1773. He owned a farm in the 96th district of South Carolina where he owned enslaved people in order to grow indigo. But by the next year, 1774, he was already involved in American politics despite his recent move there, and he was elected to the First Provincial Congress of South Carolina. And by the summer of 1776, British soldiers and loyalists were deeply entrenched in the backcountry, and they partnered with the people of the Cherokee Nation there to attack Americans and their settlements. You may remember from our last episode where I discussed Sarah and John Stewart. This partnership with Native Americans was exactly what the Americans charged John Stewart with doing in his role as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. So they accused John, who was working for the British royal government, of working with Native Americans in the backcountry against the Patriots. The Native Americans were setting fires to homes and villages. And on August 14th, Henry Laurens writes to his son John about those violent events, saying that towns like Seneca, Toxowa, and Sugartown had been destroyed. He also writes about the death of Francis Salvador and says he was a, quote, gentleman whose death is universally regretted, end quote. And all indications say that that was true even in Great Britain. He really was universally well-liked. Salvador had just moved to America from England a few years ago, and although he was fighting for the Americans, it seems like he was generally well regarded by the British. Back in July, Francis had proved himself a hero when a neighboring plantation owner, Thomas Smith, reported an attack Thomas told Francis that he had been wounded and several people had been killed, including Thomas's whole family, and many people who were enslaved on the plantation as well. So Francis jumped on his horse, headed to the home of Major Andrew Williamson, not knowing if or whether another attack may happen. So you'll sometimes hear Francis Salvador referred to as the Paul Revere of South Carolina, because he rode to the home of Major Andrew Williamson to get the word out about the attack. And Andrew Williamson was the head of the 96th Militia. So upon Francis's arrival, he gathered the troops, a process which took several days, but more and more men joined as they started traveling towards Cherokee territory. So their group got larger and larger as they went. On July 31st, the Patriots were met by a group of Native Americans, which, according to some reports, also included British soldiers, at the town of Seneca. According to a letter from Major Andrew Williamson, Salvador was shot 3 times and then was scalped. His body was returned to England, where, again, he had immigrated from just a few years before, and he was buried next to his father there. Today, there is a memorial to Francis Salvador as the first Jewish man to die in the American Revolution. It's in Washington Square near City Hall in Charleston. 2nd October, Parole Mitchell, countersign proud. Orders in camp by Major Elliott. To preserve quietness and prevent robberies in camp, a lance corporal and 3 men from the Q Guard must every hour through the night patrol the different streets of the encampment, and on hearing any noise in the huts, are to look in and take all such disorderly persons as commit riots and disturb others in their rest. And should any be discovered committing robberies, they must be instantly seized and bound neck and heels and kept with the quarter guard, and in the morning be conveyed to the Black Hole in garrison, and be there delivered with the charge against them to the officer of that guard. Orders by Major Elliott in camp, 5th October, 1776. To polish the barrel of a fusee and keep it bright after being cleaned, every soldier must carry in his pouch a thick piece of buckskin, with which he is to rub the barrel well as soon as he is relieved from his post as sentry or comes to guard. By the frequent repetition of this, the polish becomes so lasting as at length not to be spotted even by rain. Each man must also have in his pouch a worm and a wire pricker and 2 spare flints. It is recommended that the stocks of the gun be rubbed over with oil and wax, which will give it a gloss and prevent the wet from damaging it. The quartermaster will furnish the wax and oil and worm. And as it is one of the essential parts of service that regularly should be carefully attended to from the first officer to the last recruit, the soldier being obliged to hold himself in continual readiness to parade, is by that means kept constantly employed in preserving his arms, clothes, accoutrement, and person in proper order, an employment becoming a good soldier and infinitely preferable to an idle, lazy habit of loitering on beds in the day and meditating mischief for the night, or killing time by gaming, which last practice is generally the production of ruin to the pursuer. So one last warning to the boys there, because here in the order book, the handwriting changes. The first part features a summary of events for the next little bit, and the next entry is dated 9 months later, so in July of 1777. First, let's hear the summary of that gap in the timeline from October 1776 to July 1777. Major Elliott, having leave of absence for some time on account of his sick family, did not return until about the 25th of October, and then was called to town again by a particular occasion, and much about this time, the little battalion of artillery was augmented to 6 companies of 100 men each, and a colonel appointed. Lieutenant Colonel Roberts being promoted to the rank of colonel, Major Elliott succeeded to that of lieutenant colonel, and Captain Beckman to that of major. Captain White was first captain, Captain Drayton second captain, Captain Grimke third, Captain Hardin of the Port Royal Artillery being added to their battalion took rank as fourth captain. Captain Paul Trappier of the Georgetown Artillery being also added took rank as fifth captain. Lieutenant Villapanto was promoted to the rank of captain and took rank as sixth and youngest captain. Lieutenant Colonel Elliott was ordered to visit Fort Littleton and the garrison there, and to instruct them in the maneuvers of the cannon and other artillery, where he remained for a considerable time in that business, and then returning to Charlestown was in consequence of Colonel Roberts's being put in arrest, ordered to take the command at Fort Johnson on the 8th July, 1777. where he received the following general order. Headquarters General Orders by General Howe, July 7, 1777. A general court-martial is to sit on Wednesday next between the hours prescribed by the Continental Congress at some convenient place in Charlestown for the trial of Colonel Owen Roberts of the Corps of Artillery, put under arrest by Brigadier General Moultrie and charged with quitting his post and being too frequently in town without leave of the Commander-in-Chief or the commanding officer of the brigade to which he belongs, and also for having observed that an order issued by General Moultrie was unprecedented and ungentlemanlike. Of the court, Brigadier General Gadsden is to be president. The other members are to be taken from the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th regiments. Each corps to furnish a field officer and 2 captains who are to be taken accordingly to detail. Brigadier General Moultrie is to produce the evidence. The Adjutant General will transmit this order to the outposts and serve Colonel Roberts with a copy of it. Signed in Evely, Deputy Adjutant General. Okay, so a lot just happened. Barnard Elliott took some time with his family, and then he was sent down to Fort Littleton near Beaufort to teach the men there how to use their cannons and artillery. But Colonel Owen Roberts, who was overseeing several regiments, including the 4th, was arrested for leaving his post too much, and that meant a big shakeup in command. Elliott had to return to Charleston, specifically to Fort Johnson, and Colonel Roberts is now on trial. And he's being charged by William Moultrie with leaving his post too often and speaking ill of him, it sounds like, there at the end. But we know that Colonel Roberts will later die in battle. So what happens during this court-martial? We'll have to wait until next time, because that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you on the second Monday of next month. We'll see you then.